Stand by. Okay. Can you guys see and hear me now? I hope you can see and hear me. I was prattling away in a completely wrong live stream for the last 7 minutes. So those words are lost to the sands of the internet. But I hope everyone can see and hear me now. Please chime in and let me know if you can, because I'm going to restart my comments here in just a second. But before I do that, I want to make sure that I actually remedied the problem.
We don't hear you, but you have now doubled your audio.
Okay, let's see here. One moment. Okay, that should fix the audio doubling issue, Rafa. Is that so? Oh boy, technical fun. Rafa, chime in and let me know if you can hear me still anyway.
Yeah, that's perfect now, at least for me.
Okay.
Let me check on the live stream.
It sure looks like I'm live.
All right, that's good.
See. You guys chime in and let me know out there in the chat if you're seeing me. There's probably a bit of a lag on this thing.
But I cannot hear you in the Zoom session. Only I can only hear you in the live from YouTube.
Okay, well, if you can hear me in the live, I guess that's good. Let me try and enable myself in our chat and see if that, hopefully that doesn't cause that echo to come back. I'm unmuted in the Zoom. Let me know if that messes up the live stream there, Rafa. And everybody out there, if you're watching and hearing and seeing or any of the above, just give us a shout in the chat and let me know, because I want to make sure that I'm remedying whatever kinks are in the system this morning. How we sounding out there, Rafa? Are you seeing me in the stream now, Raphael?
I still can hear your audio double, but I think it's my problem maybe. Everyone in the chat is saying that everything's cool, so
okay.
Okay,
so everyone in the chat is, because I can't see. Okay, good. All right, sorry. I don't know how YouTube works, guys. At this point, I should. I indeed did not have the right chat pulled up there. Post color gear. At some point, I guess I should learn how the hell to use YouTube. So we should be good now. Okay, let's try all of that again. Good to see all of you guys, even if you weren't able to see me for a couple minutes there, but hopefully everyone can see and hear me nice and clear now, because we got some fun stuff to chop up this morning. So good morning to you all. I'm happy to see you all. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving if you celebrate Thanksgiving, and I hope you are having a good Black Friday if, like me, you're a good consumer of goods. And if not, then I hope that we're going to have some fun this morning doing stuff that has nothing to do with Thanksgiving and buying stuff, or maybe a little bit to do with buying stuff, but I'll try not to take us down that road too far. What I do want to talk about today is Resolve 17.4 and the new features implemented in Resolve 17.4. So I'm going to dive into that because I've lost a couple of minutes to my YouTube ineptitude and talk about what's new in Resolve 17.4. I'll give you guys the caveat that I threw out to the unlistening internet a moment ago, that I've only been on Resolve 17.4 for like a week or so now. I did a job on it last week, And I really haven't updated my systems here at my place to 17.4, except for purposes of today's demo. So I'm by no means an expert, and there have been quite a few changes under the hood. So I can't claim I'm going to give you a comprehensive tour, but I do want to touch on the most significant ones, at least the ones that I find most significant for my practice. So let's start by talking about what I think is definitely the most significant change in Resolve 17.4, which is the implementation of the ACES 1.3 standard. ACES 1.3 has actually been out for a little while now, and while it incorporates a number of changes under the hood, the main one for us to be aware of is that after much R&D and like waiting and development time, we finally have gamut mapping on the IDT side inside of ACES. What does all that mean? If you guys have watched some of my prior videos before, the ACES Explained series in particular, and certainly other episodes of Grade School, you may remember that we have talked about the so-called neon light problem inside of ACES. And I wish I had such a frame here in this timeline. I don't think I have anything that is going to ping that particular issue. Yeah, we'll have to use our imaginations. But basically what happens is if you are in an ACES grading environment and you're working in ACES CCT, which is one of the two sort of standard color correction working spaces for ACES, you may have a camera that has a gamut that's actually larger than the gamut of that working space. For example, an Arri Alexa or like the red wide gamut RGB gamut. Those are both significantly larger than the AP1 gamut that is designated by ACES CCT or ACES CC. So what can happen is if you have a color that is inside of your camera gamut, but kind of out on a further edge of it, like a cop light or something like that, highly bright, highly saturated color, and you are input mapping from, say, your Alexa into ACES CCT, in the traditional mapping up until ACES 1.3, that IDT system was a very simple form of input mapping that involved a tone curve and a 3x3 matrix. So there was no what we would call gamut mapping, which is aimed at the task of compressing or compacting a larger color volume into a smaller color volume. So what can happen is if you have a color that is in camera gamut but out of ACES gamut, at the IDT stage you can get clipping and get artifacting or upside down colors, like problematic visual results. And we've explored that. I can't remember which of the ACES Explained installments we touched on this in, but we touched on some solutions and ways to kind of manage this. But ACES 1.3, the reason, to me, the most significant change in ACES 1.3, and the reason I'm glad it's now implemented in Resolve, is that ACES 1.3 at long last has gamut compression built in, so that in those cases where you have those out of gamut colors, there's actually something that you can do about it. And I actually do want to see if I can find an image. You guys hang tight for just a second, and I'm going to see if I can dig up an image that will bring about this problem, because I think it's worth looking at. Let's see here. And so we'll walk through in just a moment kind of where those features are living and how we can avail ourselves of them in side of 17.4 here. Let me just find an image that I am allowed to use. I know what I'll use. I've got just the thing. Yeah, here we go. All right, so I'm going to bring in this guy and drop this down into my timeline. And by the way, as I'm doing this, guys, my sort of agenda for today is to talk about 17.4 and what I find to be the most significant changes. And like I said, we're probably not going to do a comprehensive look at everything in 17.4. So if you have other questions unrelated to 17.4 that you've been thinking about, definitely start getting those ready, because I think we will have time to kind of do some freestyle today. So let's flip this off. And so let's take a look at this image right here, okay? Let's do a ACES pipeline in miniature. We're going to do an explicit ACES pipeline in nodes because, as you guys know, I like to do things that way generally, but especially for purposes of demonstration, I like to see things spelled out explicitly in nodes. So right now, we're going to go to ACES 1.2. So we're going to go to, and this is the version of ACES that was available to us prior to this 17.4 release of Resolve. And let's say Alexa for our input transform, and for our output transform, we're going to say ACES CCT. And then on this side, we're going to do, again, ACES 1.2. Input transform is going to be ACES CCT because that's what I'm coming from. And output transform is going to be Rec 709. So this is a pipeline that we've built many, many times together in ACES and in other color management solutions as well. We've got input color space here. We've got to transform into a working color space. We do love our grading in here. And then we have an output transform that's taking us out to our display color space. And all the grading happens in between this sort of node sandwich that I've just made here, right? Familiar stuff. We've talked about it a lot. But if you notice here in this frame, this is a perfect example of the issue that I was just trying to verbally describe to you. I've got this nasty, like inverted or upside down or artifacted highlight here. And what's interesting is if I turn off my input transform, it actually goes away, which can sort of make this problem a little more confusing because we'll look at it and think, oh, is there a problem with the Alexa to ACES CCT IDT? There's not. There's an inherent problem with the fact that we are coming from a larger color volume, going to a smaller color volume, and performing no gamut mapping or compression. We're not doing anything to deal with, in this case, these really bright cyans that are outside of the ACES CCT or AP1 gamut. Instead, we're just letting them clip out at the edge, which doesn't produce very nice results. So let's look at the difference if I flip from ACES 1.2 to ACES 1.3. And if you look here in ACES 1.3, I now have this new menu that wasn't here in 1.2 for gamut compress, like so. And if I look at this gamut compress dropdown, I can say ACES reference gamut compress, or I can do the parametric gamut compress if I want to really control the individual parameters. But the stock values here at the reference values that are implicitly passed here in this selection of gamut compression type, you can see it fixes the issue, right? So it's a really good solve to a problem that we've talked about numerous different solutions to over the prior months, and none of them are a one size fits all, and none of them are perfect. In my opinion, this gamut compression algorithm that has been implemented in ACES 1.3 is as good as you're going to get. It's a really, really good solution for this fundamental problem of like, hey, I've got gamut A, which is larger than gamut B, and I wish to hold everything that was in gamut A in gamut B. Ultimately, there's no way to do that. You guys know my favorite analogy, and this is another example of it, of trying to fit 10 pounds of dirt into a 5-pound sack. That's essentially what we're doing when we say take area-wide gamut, for example, and turn it into ACES AP1. One is larger than the other, so it simply the second simply can't contain the first. But we can do a better job of rolling off and compressing those out of gamut values and producing a more pleasing result like you guys see here. So that's, to me, maybe the most significant change in Resolve 17.4 is it now supports this ACES 1.3 standard that's been out for a while, but we've had no way to avail ourselves of inside of Resolve without resorting to a DCTL, which I had talked about a little bit in prior grade schools in terms of like you actually did have the ability prior to 17.4 to get a DCTL of this gamut compression algorithm, but obviously you had to be a bit more sophisticated and a bit more of a DIYer to go down that rabbit hole. So I'm really glad that it's implemented in a vanilla fashion here inside of Resolve 17.4. So that's the ACES 1.3 update here inside of 17.4. The other thing that is definitely worth talking about is if I go to my project settings now and I go to my color management, we talk about color management a lot here on the channel, don't we? We talk about it every single week just about in grade school, and almost all of my videos are predicated on color management, and a lot of them talk about it explicitly. So if there's changes to the color management system inside of Resolve, I want to know about them, and I definitely want to share them with you guys. Let's take a look at what happens in our DaVinci YRGB color managed setting. We have this automatic color management setting available to us now, where it's essentially trying to simplify things for us and make things a bit more turnkey. Now, I think this is 100% the right idea. Color management, as any of you guys know who've been listening to me talk about it for a little while, know that it's complex and it's not the most intuitive thing. Once you kind of get it, you get it. but it takes a while to get there. At least it did for me, and I think it has.
Hey, Colin, we cannot see the
Oh,
color management window.
Oh, you can't see that window. This drives me nuts too. Okay. This one I have an easier fix for. Hang on. I'm going to add this to my setting. And by the way, everyone, this gentleman who is periodically chiming in and making sure that I'm making stuff that you guys can see and hear is Raphael, who is here to help us out as always with questions and keeping things flowing. So thanks to Raphael for supporting the broadcast this morning. Okay, so let's see. I've got that lined up here. Let's see how this works. Okay, there you go. So you should now be able to see my resolve window. Good. Or my project settings window. So I was talking about this automatic color management setting here that when we have it turned on, it simplifies what was already a sort of simplified drop-down menu here inside of Resolve Color Management even further. And as I said, I think this is absolutely the right idea. I'll say this. Here's where I think the challenge comes in. Doing your color management in this way, to me, is sort of a similar proposition to like color managing here in the project settings in general. I think it's a bit problematic because the only user who is going to find this to be beneficial is the user who really needs to be doing it manually so that they can get a better understanding of what they're doing. So in other words, I would say if you want to use this automatic color management, there's absolutely no reason you shouldn't, as long as you understand what's going on under the hood, as long as you understand what Resolve is doing on your behalf. The challenge is, once you understand what Resolve is doing on your behalf, you generally are going to want to exert explicit control over those processes. So the only, as I said, the most succinct way I can put it is the only user that this benefits is a user who really needs to be turning it off so that they can gain that more granular understanding of the way their color management works. Because when you're in this mode, it's pretty tough to ferret out problems or even to visualize, well, what's my color processing pipeline and where might my problems be arising? It's pretty tough to troubleshoot that stuff or to aim at different behaviors or to tweak things when it's all wrapped up into this very tidy bundle on the outer edge. It has benefit, of course, because it's easier for us. It's less intimidating, right, than to do this, or even worse, to pick a custom preset here. But there's a reason all these parameters exist, and just because we are flipping these boxes doesn't mean those parameters go away. It just means that they are being manipulated on our behalf, which are the exact parameters we're going to want to manipulate ourselves the moment any kind of problems or issues arise with the way our image is being reproduced. So kind of a philosophical tangent there, but that's a significant change that has happened in here in our color management. And I would encourage you guys, despite the fact that I really like this idea, and I think we are going to continue to see the idea of streamlining and simplifying the color management component of color grading, we're going to see that continue to get improved and made more efficient and more streamlined and more user-friendly. Right now, what I would encourage to all you guys is exactly what I do, which is to leave that off. And if you're color managing in your project settings at all, to keep things probably on custom. It's a bit more to swallow and understand up front, but once you do, it's very easy for to go into your project settings and change things around as needed. So that would be my recommendation there. All right, I'm going to close my project settings, and let's see if my Resolve now returns to visibility. There we go. I'm learning very slowly how to manipulate all of this streaming software. So that's item number 2, the color management system tweaks there inside of our project settings. The next thing that might be kind of fun to talk about is this, I think it's called a mixer. Yeah, this custom mixer that has come about here inside of Resolve. There's a couple of new open effects filters, which I think are kind of the main other category of change to talk about here inside of 17.4. And before I go on to the mixer, actually, we can talk about the halation plugin. I don't think you guys need me to show you the halation plugin. If you're interested in halation, it's fun that we now have a built-in filter to drop it on and see how it treats your images. So far, I haven't been blown away by it yet, but I also haven't put it through its paces. So I'll leave it to you guys to play around with it, and you can let me know in the comments for today or in a community comment or wherever. I love the halation. It looks amazing. Or like, wow, it's really not doing the trick. My jury is still out on that. But what I did want to talk about as the other like sort of key change in the effects is this mixer here. Now the mixer is the way they describe it in the Resolve documentation is like, let's try this. Let's just add some contrast to this image and pivot things a little bit. The mixer is characterized in the documentation as a layer mixer node on steroids. I don't think that exact language is used, but you get the idea. So a layer mixer node being this guy right here. I've just built a layer mixer, and this is the guy that controls how does this interact with this, right? And we know in Resolve that at a baseline, node number 4 is going to take visual priority of over node number 3. So even though it's the bottom, like spatially on the bottom layer, it's actually on the top. If you think about the way things work in like Photoshop or even in like the edit page on Resolve, everything stacks up vertically. Things stack downward vertically with a layer mixer here inside of Resolve. And then we can right click on that layer mixer and we can alter the compositing mode and get different results by making that manipulation. So if I did like a color adjustment here, I could now affect just my contrast by manipulating this bottom visual priority bottom layer, which happens to be spatially in the top of these two nodes. So that's kind of the extent of what we can do in terms of designating the interaction of two layers with a stock layer mixer node. So if I wipe this all out, what this custom mixer is all about is about giving you some greater control over that process. So if I wanted to produce exactly what I had a moment ago, just to kind of connect up the custom mixer to a layer mixer, I could do the following. I could pipe input 1 of the custom mixer to this node that this contrast node that I made a minute ago. And then I could take a clean output of my input mapped image and pipe it into my second input on this custom mixer, and then connect that up to my output. And then I could, here inside of the custom mixer, do a combine, or I suppose my blend color mode here. And then I could go down to this same color mode that I had a moment ago, although I don't actually see that. That's interesting. Oh, I guess they're calling them colorize and luminosity for some reason. Anyway, that tangent aside, what I've just done with this custom mixer is reproduce exactly what I was doing with the layer mixer a moment ago. Whoop-de-doo, that's great. What's fun about the custom mixer is you can see here, we've got some different sliders that we can use to control the way that we are blending input input 2 and input 1. So like, if we imagine, like if we go to a more vanilla blending mode here, just to make things a little bit easier to follow, if I just go to a normal blending mode here, and I change these sliders in the ganged position with everything at 0, all I'm doing is admitting all of node 2 and none of the clean manipulation of the image, if that makes sense. And if I move my slider over to the right, now all I'm doing is admitting this branch of the tree and none of this contrast node down below. So those are the two extremes. And I can modulate anywhere in between. And of course, this is also something we actually can do with a layer mixer just by changing the key output gain of the top layer. That's essentially what I'm doing here. But what I think is kind of fun about this is if I ungang things, I can change that blending per channel, and it's quite easy to envision getting some interesting creative results out of that. So that's really the main distinction there between the blending modes here. And then of course we have color spaces as well, where we can control what color space these blending operations are happening inside of. And to be honest with you guys, I haven't exactly played around with how these, what these mean, what they're doing. My intuition would be that they are observing the color management, the timeline color space in my project settings, and using that. So let's just say, for example, that I don't know, let's say we want to go to area Alexa linear. And even though and let's say that my timeline color space is area Alexa log C, okay? My intuition here would be that prior to marrying these two layers together, this custom mixer is transforming both branches of the input into area Alexa linear from area Alexa log C, based on the fact that my timeline color space is log C, performing the blend, and then inverting that transformation and putting me back out into my timeline or my working color space. That would be my informed guess there, because anytime you guys see a selection for a color space and a gamma, but you don't see a pair of them, you have to wonder, okay, we know that to make any color space transformation, I need two pairs of information. Where is the other pair coming from in this case? And in the case of Resolve, there's really nowhere for that other pair, for that missing pair to come from, except from my project setting. So I'm going to double check that in the next time that I have occasion to use this custom mixer mode out in the wild. And if I'm getting it dead wrong, I'll come back and issue a retraction. But I'm pretty confident that's what we're looking at here with the custom mixer. And the main thing to point out about the custom mixer that I didn't understand when I first started playing around with it the other day is you can see I've got an RGB input 1, alpha input 1, RGB input 2, alpha input 2, but I only get those if I drop this into an empty section of the node graph. If I, as an alternative, drop it onto an empty node, it doesn't work. I don't have the inputs that I need to actually do something useful with this custom mixer. So if you do want to use it, drop it onto an empty section of the node graph, and that way you'll have all of the necessary inputs to actually do something interesting. So those are kind of the main things that I wanted to touch on about 17.4, and let's go to some questions. Let's hear what you guys got out there. You with me, Raphael? Oh no, Raphael's had enough of me. He's done with me.
All right, we have a question from Jim Robinson from the last week. The color warper doesn't seem to reflect the same trace of... Okay, I'm having delay with the live. So the color warper doesn't seem to reflect the same trace as the vectorscope at any setting. Maybe. Okay, this is so confusing because I cannot hear you in the live session from Zoom. All right, I'm just gonna say the question. The color warper doesn't seem to reflect the same trace as the vectorscope at any setting, and appears to be worse using RCM. Seems to be skewed by about 4 degrees, and saturation is not mapped linearly in the UV plane. When you place color swatches and compare the trace to the vectorscope, there is noticeably less saturation in some hues like magenta. Have you noticed this or given it any thought?
Yeah, good question. And Raphael, can you hear me now in our side chat?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
Now
that's
I can
better.
hear you.
Yeah. Sorry about that. That would have been impossible to keep working.
Yeah, that was a little bit confusing. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this is a good question that Jim is asking, that he's basically observing that if I look at my vectorscope here and I look at the traces and then I look at my vectorscope there, the traces are different, aren't they? That is, I'm going to assume, because the color model is being taken into account in the rendering of these traces. So if I change my color model down below, it will change this trace here in the color warper. So what's happening is that we are looking at our traces inside of the color model that we choose within our within the color warper, which is a different color model than the RGB or the YUV color model that's being used here in the vectorscope. So that's what accounts for that difference. Is it's just rendering them inside of a different space that is internal to the color warper. And that's a good thing to bring up, but I think it's, like it would be perhaps an interesting feature to request, like, hey, could I see how the color warper renders out in terms of like a, like after being transformed back into an RGB model. Although I guess at that point we could say like we could just look at our vectorscope for that, though we are also looking at the stack of whatever happens afterward in our vectorscope. So you might indeed want to, if you want to get a normal, like scaling of things inside of the vectorscope, a normal relationship to these patches, you might need to turn off your output transform so that you can see what your manipulations here are actually doing to a vectorscope preview, if that's more meaningful to you. But really good question. I hadn't actually thought about that before. And yeah, it's funny, like just total tangent, just because Jim's question got me thinking about it. The color warper, I feel like I was so enamored of the color warper when it came out, but I have to be honest with you guys. I think it might just be because of the panel mapping thing. And I'm optimistic they'll maybe find a way to map this onto a mini or even an advanced panel. But I've ended up like, I almost never use the color warper, not because like it's never like done anything bad, but I also have not really found it to be able to do anything better or cleaner than what I can get out of my curves over here. So I'd be interested to hear from Jim or any of you guys, like if you've done any kind of comparison between like for example, you could use a combination of hue versus sat and hue versus hue curves over in your curves section to do the same character of manipulation that you can do here with the spider web in the color warper. So you guys chime in and let me know if you're like, oh my God, the color warper is so much better. What are you talking about? Or if you maybe agree with me that there's not that much of a net difference in terms of the results that you're able to get. Just something that Jim's question got me thinking about. But yeah, that's the reason for that change in the traces is we're looking at these traces through the lens of whatever color model we're operating inside of. What else we got?
All right, let's go to another question from Jim, this time regarding halation. Halation in front of the nodes or at the back of the nodes? Something changed with the plugin?
Halation in front of the nodes or in back of the nodes? So are we talking about like sequencing, I assume? Like node sequencing?
Yeah, probably like at the end of the node tree or at the beginning.
Gotcha. Yeah, so it kind of comes back to like this relates to a conversation we've had a couple times about grain, where we're like, well, where should grain go? Should grain go at the head or at the tail of the node tree? In the case of grain, you could kind of make a case for both. That it's like, well, do you want positive or negative grain, or do you want some of both? In which case, maybe you put it in both places. In the case of halation, to my understanding, halation is a negative characteristic. You're really not going to get halation with a print. So to the extent that that's true, my intuition would be that you would want to put that at the very head of your node graph so that you can operate on your image in its negative state, and then run everything downstream of there. And especially like, I guess it depends on, I'll put it this way to like give a more practical answer. Where I would put halation, and let's just use the new halation thing because it's here and see how it feels. It's going to ping like hell on this image. We know that. Oh, that's actually pretty mellow considering the fact that this image is all highlights. I mean, let's just play around with this for a minute. So we've got our threshold here, which I assume is just based on a 0 to 1 luminance value, film saturation level. I'm not quite sure what that is. Dial layer reflections. Okay, there we go. So we're really starting to get some of those edges kind of up here now. That's not half bad. So what I would do in terms of halation, I would put it, I would still sort of try to observe that idea that I just talked about of like putting it appropriately far enough upstream in my node graph. So for example, I would want to have it, of course, upstream of my display transform, but also upstream of like a creative transform, like I might do, like maybe I'll just do let's just use one of my colloid pieces, this could be anything. I think I've moved this directory. Oh no, that's good. So that we're in ACES CCT right now. So I'm just applying this look to my image like so. So I would do my halation upstream of my creative contrast. I would make it, think about it this way. It would perhaps become the earliest ingredient in my global look. So I would put it downstream of my shot level grading, but the very first ingredient in my look level macro processes. And that's because I want it to be appropriately upstream. And you can even see, like, look how much more dramatic the halation got when I bumped up my contrast with my creative contrast layer here, or at least perceptually dramatic, I should say. So that's where I would place that for a variety of reasons. But one of them is that I would like to, in a default mode, I'd like to think about hitting my halation process with a reasonably consistent exposure and contrast ratio, which of course is like a huge part of what we're doing at the individual shot level. So like on a shot like this, I would be exposing down quite a bit before I move things into play, before I as my creative transformation. Oh, and that's actually interesting that our blue light is coming back into play a little bit. Let's just play some jazz here and see if we can't get things a little bit more back into our, see with that exposure adjustment, if I can't recover that cyan piece. You guys can see my very scientific manipulation of these sliders, basically seeing what works. It might be a question of changing my exposure index. That's interesting that small exposure change. I wonder if that's okay. Yeah, so that's from a combination of factors, and in fact I think it might be the fault of my colloid plugin here, which itself is mapping things into ACES CCT without gamut mapping itself. So I think that might actually be on me rather than the virtual working group that gave us this very robust gamut mapping algorithm. But actually, this is kind of fun. Let's try something out real quick here. This is a bit of a tangent and this is a bit complex. So if you don't follow it all, that's okay. But I also think this could be a fun demonstration of the utility of this tool in action. So let's simplify a little bit. I'm actually going to wipe out this halation and we'll come full circle back to a very simple question that was asked several minutes ago, but we've ended up having the opportunity to answer some other interesting questions. So if we look at just our stack, so we've got an ACES pipeline that with our ACES 1.3 gamut compression, we've used to recover this kind of clippiness up here on the upper side. We've got our output transform. I've just dropped an instance of my print transform here. And I've then observed that when I expose down underneath that, I'm getting a little bit clippy in this region here. Although, am I crazy? I really don't feel like that's as bad as it was a moment ago. Let's get that halation back in the mix and just see if that was maybe making it, maybe the halation was making it worse. To be honest, that's not as egregious as it felt to me a moment ago, and I don't think worth the 10-minute detour I was going to go on here. Basically, what I was going to say is you can deploy, in addition to saying at the input stage, I want to compress my gamut, just to make a simpler example of what I was going to demonstrate. Let's turn this back off for a moment and turn this back off for a moment. So here we are with our ugly artifacted highlight again. And what we can do is even once we're inside of ACES, I can simply say, I can basically make a null transform and say, hey, my input is ACES CCT and my output is ACES CCT, but I want to compress my gamut, like so. So that can be, to me, another really interesting use of this because, like, without getting too far into the weeds of these things, gamut mapping in between source and working color space is not ideal. We don't ideally want to be moving from big volume to smaller volume at any stage until we absolutely have to. And we don't have to right now. It's just that those are the boundaries of the gamut that we have selected, the AP1 gamut. So I might, if I were working in ACES, which I don't do a ton these days, but I do sometimes, I might choose to work in ACES and kind of ride bareback, if you will, do no gamut compression as my stock IDT, and then have this node saved off just to deploy where necessary. So that if I encounter a shot like this, rather than having to gamut map everything leading up for the entire timeline, I would just gamut map as needed with an individual node. So I was going to demo that in another way, but this is actually a cleaner demonstration for it anyway. So I'm glad that came up. Back to our halation question, just to round out that conversation, head of the global or the macro level look, downstream of the actual individual shot level manipulations, simply because if we think about the task of color grading, you know, what I'm fundamentally trying to do when I color grade is I'm trying to marry everything into a consistent exposure and contrast ratio, right? So to the extent that that's true, the work that I do in between input here and macro level look, which is right now all at the same spot, but in between here and here where I'm doing my shot level grading, whatever happens at that stage is going to net images which are more consistent with one another after this point than they were before that point. So theoretically, I will be feeding a more consistent image into my halation process, which will cause my halation process to render more consistent results. So I can use the halation not just as a bit of localized seasoning, but actually as part of the visual glue that really holds everything together. So that's a big long answer, not only to one question, but to like 5 other questions that nobody asked me, but I hope someone was wondering about them, or at least that you found the answer interesting anyway. But let's hear what else we got out there.
All right, let's go to workflow. CTC Wired wants to know, how do you optimize your workflow for large projects, aka hundreds of shows you need to get through quickly?
Oh yeah, good question. So some of those things we've talked about before, and we can find the links after today's broadcast to like the first thing that comes to mind there is making sure that everything is set up for remote grades at the outset, so that anytime that one shot is in more than one timeline, it's at the baseline receiving the same treatment. And then if later in the process we want to give different treatment to the same shot because of its position in different timelines, you can sort of create a fork in the road wherever you want to. But that's one that really helps me, is to make sure that I'm using remote grades whenever possible, which sort of connects back up to like the way you request your prep from your clients, because depending on the way that your prep comes in, you may or may not be able to use remote grades. So that's a tangent in and of itself. But basically one of the things that I try to ensure on large projects for this reason is like, hey, do me a favor and like don't media manage, like just give me everything, because it'll allow me to remote grade stuff a little bit more reliably. So there's some kind of hacks that can feed into the way you request your prep there. And I really do find the remote grading thing to be a time saver. The other one that I definitely use that you guys have seen me use plenty is I'll do group grading. So this won't be like a super dramatic example because most of this material in here is airy. But let's try this experiment. What I want to do is efficiently, let's say instead of a timeline rather of 17 shots, I have a timeline of 1700 shots. And what I would like to do is efficiently organize each of my different flavors of input or source material into a different group, which is going to have a different input transform to get me into my working color space, as an example. The way that I will typically do that, if I reset all my grades here, I'm going to use my clips, my smart filter function here. So let's just say for starters, I want to have Resolve show me all of my red material. So if I go here to my media pool properties, or to my, can you guys see this? Let me make sure that's popping up. No. Okay. See, I'm learning. Hang tight. Let me turn this window that I now have on and make it visible. Okay, so here is this create smart filter menu that pops up when I what I did here is I went to my clips drop down menu, this little arrow. Let me cancel out of here for just a second. Clips, create smart filter. That was what I hit. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to type in red here, and I'm basically going to create a smart filter that goes hunting for all of my red material. So I'm going to say media pool properties, file name contains R3D. Okay, that's going to give me all of the clips in this timeline which have a file name which contains the characters R3D, which is the extension of a raw red camera negative. And you can see my timeline of 17 shots has been filtered down to 3 shots, like so. So if I hit create here, I can now bundle. In this case, it's easy because there's only 3, but maybe there'd be 300 in that 1700 shot timeline. I can now hit Command A, right click, add into a new group, and I can say red. Looks like I already have that group label for some other reason, so let's say red 2. And now I can go to my group pre-clip, and in this case I can use a power grade that I already have saved off to get me from red into log C, red wide gamut RGB log 3G10 to Alexa log C. I've already saved off that power grade, so I don't have to put a bunch of time into it. And now I've grouped and appropriately input mapped all of my red material. And now I can create another filter, and I can look for my airy stuff. This one will be a little bit trickier because I have both airy raw and vanilla ProRes inside of my media pool. So there's kind of a fine art to like figuring out how to filter for different types of media. But in this case, I would do something like this. I would say my video codec contains airy. That's going to cover all of my airy raw. And then I'm going to say match any of the following rules. And we'll say that under media pool properties, my video codec it contains ProRes 444. Now, I could still have a ProRes 444 that was not, in fact, airy. And in that case, I might want to start to filter for metadata and get really fancy. But in the case of something like this, I can see it's working great for me, and it often will work great if I only have 444 that is airy. So like I said, kind of a fine art to selecting for these different criteria. But these criteria for this smart filter work for me to isolate only my airy material and all of my airy material, which is my goal. So now that I've created this, let me turn this filter off now. Now that I've created this, I'm going to do the same thing. Right click, add into a new group. I probably already have an airy group, so I'm just going to call this airy underscore airy. And in the case of airy, because I happen to be working in this hypothetical project in airy log C, I don't need to input map it at all. I've just got a separate group for it just for fun. But you can see how I would ripple this out for every one of my sources. I would create a smart filter, select all, add into a new group for that camera or source, and then create a custom input mapping for that camera or source. And then when all was said and done, I could go to this clip filtration drop-down menu here and turn back onto all clips. And I've now very efficiently been able to input map and sort all of my different camera material and work my way through the timeline. And then the other one that pops out to me, like there's so many of these that come to mind in terms of optimizing long form workflow. But the other one that definitely stands out to me that I don't have a great, it won't make a ton of sense here because this is not a timeline that was of material shot at similar time of day. But you can go to your timeline thumbnail mode. If you go to your view, timeline thumbnail mode. Now, does that pop up in OBS? Rafa, can you see that on my, I guess it'll take you a second for the feed to appear.
Yeah, I'm waiting.
Okay. Well, let me know if you can't. But what I'm doing, guys, is I'm going to the view menu, timeline thumbnail mode, and then I'm selecting, instead of record A mode, I'm going to source C mode. And you can see there are actually shortcuts for that too, which I definitely use. And what this does is it changes the sequencing of every shot in your timeline so that instead of being assembled in the order that they were edited, i.e. the record mode.
We cannot see it.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad I explicitly designated that. So again, it's view menu. About halfway down, there's timeline thumbnail mode. And then inside of timeline thumbnail mode, you have two options. You have record A mode, which is the normal mode. And then you have source C mode. And I'll flip between those two here, Right now I'm in record mode, and it's just showing me the way that this timeline of random clips that I made for grade school was actually pieced together in sequence. But if I flip over to C mode, I'm now seeing the source time code. So things are being sorted by the time code of the source material, of the individual sources, as opposed to the time code of my timeline, which can be really useful because if you think about the way that a production gets shot, am I going to shoot a master and then go shoot a single and then say, oh, let's actually go back and do the master again and then go and shoot another take of the single? No, I'm going to do things in setups, aren't I? So by grouping things by in that C mode fashion, I can grade setups instead of grading in the timeline mode, which ultimately won't give me the context that I need, but what it will give me is back to back to back of all like shots, shot at the same time, shot in the same setup, so that it's easier for me to kind of line them up to one another and quickly batch my way through them once I have a look for whatever, like Cullen's single. Once I have a look for that, I can just apply that grade to every single shot that falls next to it. And then once I've taken a full pass through the timeline in that C mode, I can flip back out to record mode and actually see how those graded shots work with each other contextually and make refinements and tweaks. But that's another one that I use on every project where I've got more than, say, 50 or so shots, just because it makes it easier to get through that first pass and not have to keep switching gears between tweaking and grading one setup and then another, and then back to that first setup and then do a third setup and then back to that second setup. It lets you do everything kind of in a batch. And notwithstanding my bumpy start here, we have made our way through most of an hour today. So I'll take another question or two, and then I'll give you guys back your weekend.
All right, next question comes from Mamoun Abu Farha, something like that. Do you take your toolbox of powergrades / TCTLs with you when you're freelancing at another facility?
Good question. Generally, yes. It kind of depends on what I'm working on. I'll say that it's not uncommon when I am at a facility for me to be slotting into an existing workflow, in which case I will do that to a bare minimum. Like here inside of my domain, inside of my world where I do most of my work, I can do whatever I want because it's a closed loop. Everything is happening here inside of my system. Once I'm slotting into another workflow, I try to let what I do be as vanilla as possible. So as an easy example, something that I've shown you guys before, where if I was grading here at home, I might use my colloid exposure tool to pull and push stops. If I'm in a facility, I'll probably just do my gamma to linear and make that slight tweak to my workflow and adjust my exposure using my gain instead of the exposure tool. So I'll make little accommodations and adjustments there as needed. And often what I'll do is like, if there's like the most common thing that's like, I can't get what I want to with the vanilla tools of Resolve, there's just no way to get there. I'll usually cook a LUT or two that's like, hey, this is the show LUT for this that's based on whatever, like a set of like tuned parameters in colloid or like something custom that I've cooked up with all my tools. I can always cook that down into a LUT and just bring it with me and say like, hey, this is the show LUT. And that way it's very easy to install on that system. And it's just a binary thing. It's not like it has to be, it's a lot simpler to install and to make sure it's reliable than it is to try to portage all of my power grades and tools over. And I will say, like, to go back to the specific question about the toolbox, any of this stuff that just represents saved presets from within Resolve, like my ins and outs here are probably a better example. Those I will bring over as power grades because all they're doing is saving time. They're not relying on external tools or like non-vanilla features. They're literally just like, hey, I'm tired of selecting red wide gamut RGB, red log 3G10, area Alexa log C, and then area log C. I just want to have a preset for that. So any of these power grades that are just saved templates of stuff within Resolve, I usually will take with me as well. Let's do one more, please.
Okay, this one from Easy Sonka wants to know if there is any rule of thumbs to know where and when to use curves in a linear mode.
Where and when to use curves in a linear mode, meaning that you're actually grading in a linear space?
Yeah, probably like the old halation method.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Like, the same basic rules apply, whether you're in linear or a log space, in terms of when you would want to use curves versus straight lines. The really only difference to us creatively is that the ranges are very different when we are in a linear model versus in a log model. So easy example. Let's look at this. Let's get an output transform going on here so that we've got a sensible looking image. And an easy example would be, and you guys won't see this because my project settings don't pop up, but I'm just confirming my timeline color space is set to area log C. And what I want to do now is use curves in a log model for starters, okay? So for that, let's actually do this like so. I'm going to add an exposure chart in area log C, which is just showing me middle gray in the middle surrounded by stops below and above middle gray, which is a useful tool for me. So if I'm looking at log C and I create a new node downstream here, this allows me to quite easily eyedropper my middle gray patch. And this is actually telling me, okay, this control point that I've just dropped on my curves, that's my middle gray. So if I adjust things below that point, I'm adjusting the toe below middle gray. And if I adjust things above that point, I'm manipulating the shoulder above middle gray, right? Makes perfect sense. So this would be like a simple way that I might draw a contrast curve, like a creative contrast curve maybe, inside of a log container. Now, let's try something else out here. Let's do this. Let's say that I'm now working in a linear model. I'm going to change my gamma to linear here, and then I'm going to feed linear into this image. If we eyedropper my middle gray in linear, I can still draw curves all I want. There's no issue with that. But take a look at where my mid gray lives inside of a linear tone curve. It lives here. So my entire shadow region is functioning just in this very bottom area, and everything above that is highlights. And this is like just one of many examples I could give you of the sort of like non-intuitive nature of operating in linear. There are certain things that feel very intuitive, like exposure, for example, which obviously I was just doing. It's like, oh man, switch it to linear gamma, swing that gain wheel, and man, things just feel really intuitive. It feels like I'm controlling the amount of physical light. But in terms of like manipulating the signal in between 0 and 1, as opposed to just manipulating that gain slider, things can feel a little bit funky because it's not like our intuition would not be like, if I were to ask a layperson, hey, look at this XY graph, where do you think that like a middle exposed gray would be? Most people would not pick 18% from the bottom, would they? Because that's not the way we perceive middle gray, even though in a linear model, that actually is where middle gray lives and everything else lives up above there. But shadows are very important to us in terms of our visual system. So that's one of many examples I could give that just points at how we have to tread a little more carefully when we are using curves or really any manipulation in linear, simply because the effective ranges of things are not very intuitive. So there's essentially like a good portion of the curve is going to be occupied by less significant things ultimately. So like in the same way that I feel like I could use some more real estate to manipulate the bottom end of my curve, I also don't really need 80% of my real estate to be dedicated to the high end above middle gray, but that's what I have when I'm working in linear. And the same thing is going to be true regardless of the kind of manipulation we're making. Like we might be playing with a linearized version of our saturation channel or any other number of crazy things I could talk about. So that's the main thing to be aware of when you're working in linear, is that things are going to be, you can't make assumptions about what the tonal regions you're manipulating actually are, because they're going to be pretty non-intuitive, and you're going to have to actually have some kind of objective metric like I just used to say like, hey, where actually is mid-gray in linear so that I can appropriately anchor my transformations. So lots of good stuff that we can do in a linear model, but candidly, I think one of the reasons it hasn't caught on more than it has and why it's still more an exception than a rule is because it's not very intuitive in the way that we're talking about. Like it requires that we anchor ourselves in a fundamentally different way than when we're working in log, which is much more similar to the response of our eyes, and for that reason feels much more intuitive. So long answer, but hopefully an interesting one. And let's do one more. I want to give you guys your hours worth. I made you wait for me at the beginning.
All right, let's go to, for example, another question regarding halation. How do you think the new halation effect from Resolve compares to your solution for creating halation?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you. The little experimentation that we did with it today is like the most time that I've spent with that plugin thus far. And it's interesting. Like, I'll answer the question this way, that for me, everybody has their own relationship with what they do and with their craft. Like, you know, whether you're an artist or an engineer, whatever it is that you do. I know for me, for better or for worse, this is a strength and can also be a liability. I really have a compulsion to understand what something is doing before I reach for it. And actually, my friend Walter Volpato talked about this in our conversation here on Grade School a while back, and he's talked about it in other venues as well, that he has that similar compulsion to really understand on a pretty granular level what an operation is doing before he feels comfortable using it. I'm cut from that same cloth, and if anything, I take it sometimes to too far of an extreme where I'm like, no, I actually want to see the math. And then I'm like, well, no, I actually want to code up the math before I can really feel comfortable with it. That's not always a great thing. So I don't mean to necessarily signal that as a virtue, but that is, you know, kind of my disposition as an artist. So for that reason, I don't see myself moving off of my halation solution because I do like what it does. And what would most excite me about if I try to imagine tomorrow moving on to some brand new halation solution, it would be because someone illuminated to me a better model for modeling halation and showed me the how and then showed me the why of how that worked. That would be more intriguing to me than a tool that simply produces interesting visual results, if that makes sense. So that's the long answer. The short answer is that in our little bit of experimenting today, I thought it looked pretty good. I don't really know what's going on under the hood. I don't quite know like the range of potential results that you can get, or whether there's any stability issues, or if there are any kind of edge cases that pop up if you're using it constantly. But for me, I probably, the burden of proof would be on the tool to prove itself more useful to me or more visually beautiful than my own version. And absent that, I would be more compelled by someone saying like, you've been getting it all wrong, because actually what's happening in the chemistry or the physics of an actual halation response is more like this than what you're doing, and you can model in a different way and you can get more accurate results because of it, and you should try that. That would be more intriguing to me than like, check out this new halation plugin. So that's my peculiar relationship to the tool, but I would say from the little experimentation that we've done today, I certainly wouldn't be shy about it. And whether you're comparing that and Filmbox's halation or that and Cullen's halation method that I've shared with you guys, I think that's a fun experiment that you should definitely undertake. Of like, well, which one does look visually best to me? Which one do I like most? Which one is the most stable? And you know, there's no substitute for just running the tests and seeing what you like best. And that's a good one to end on, guys. Thanks as always for joining me for a Grade School Friday morning, and thank you to Raphael for co-hosting with me. Thanks for your patience as we worked through the technical kinks at the beginning of today's episode. And yeah, really excited to get to hang out with you guys for a little bit on this Black Friday post-Thanksgiving morning. I will mention before I take off today, for those of you who are interested or who have previously done trials of my colloid tool bundle, we do have a Black Friday sale going for those right now. It's usually the only one that we do in a given year. Subscriptions right now are 50% off for the life of the subscription if you sign up before Monday. So if you've been interested and you're on the fence, then it's a good window to get in there and get some savings that don't often pop up. And you can also download a free trial and check it out right now. And you've got a couple days to say, oh my God, I love this. I want to grab it. Or it's not worth it to me and I don't want to spend the money. But I would encourage you to go check it out if you're on the fence or interested in that at all. And in the meanwhile, I'm looking forward to getting together with you guys again next week and getting some more content out to you guys. I've got so much stuff planned for next month and for next year, and I can't wait to share it all with you guys. It's going to be a really exciting year, and I'm really excited to take everything that we've done this year in 2021 together and really push that to the next level. You guys have continued to inspire me with your hunger for good knowledge and best practices, and I want to give you more and more of that stuff and do more next year than we did this year. So looking forward to taking that journey with you guys. In the meanwhile, have an awesome weekend. Have a great Friday, and we will see you guys next week.